So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue of Parmenides. I'm not going to give a comprehensive overview of where we've been. It's usually too much to do that, but just in a general sense, we've been speaking about the forms. We're at this sort of introductory stage in Socrates' philosophical progression. In this dialogue, he's a younger man being instructed or led by older philosophers. And in this, we think about the form as a structure, or the forms in general as a structure, an architecture through which we can see how things come to be, how they participate in unity, and how multiplicity is integrated in that unity. Now, so far in this dialogue, that's sort of what we're after. We're at, like I said, we're at an introductory stage of that philosophical pursuit. And so the progression has been that I've read one page and then gone through it, interpreted it, and so forth, reflected on it, and then progressed from there to the second page and so forth and so on. And so we're going to continue in that vein. So I'd like to read this page and get on with it. Socrates, in what way, then, will the other things get a share of your forms, if they can do neither by getting parts nor by getting wholes? By Zeus, Socrates exclaimed, it strikes me that's not at all easy to determine. And what do you think about the following? What's that? I suppose you think each form is one on the following ground. Whenever some number of things seem to you to be large, perhaps there seems to be some one character, the same as you look at them all, and from that you conclude that the large one is one. That's true, he said. What about the large itself, and the other large things? If you look at them all in the same way with the mind's eye, again, won't some one thing appear large, by which all these appear large? It seems so. So another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself and the things that partake of it, and in turn, another over all these, by which all of them will be large. Each of your forms will no longer be one, but unlimited in multitude. But, Parmenides, maybe each of these forms is a thought, Socrates said, and properly occurs only in minds. In this way, each of them might be one and no longer face the difficulties mentioned just now. What do you mean? He asked. Is each of the thoughts one, but a thought of nothing? No, that's impossible, he said. Of something, rather? Yes. Of something that is, or of something that is not? Of something that is. Isn't it of some one thing? That thought thinks is over all the instances, being some one character. Yes, then won't this thing that is thought to be one, being always the same over all the instances, be a form? That, too, appears necessary. And what about this, said Parmenides? Given your claim that other things partake of forms, won't you necessarily think either that each thing is composed of thoughts and all things think, or that although they are thoughts, they are unthinking? That isn't reasonable either, Parmenides, he said. No, what appears most likely to me is this. These forms are like patterns set in nature, and other things resemble them and are likenesses, and this partaking of the forms is, for other things, simply being modeled on them. So we ran into some difficulty in the last episode. And that has to do with how the forms, or how oneness, in a sense, the purity of something, let's say the form of beauty, or the form, like they're saying here, of largeness, how this can participate in things when there are many things that are, well, I'll say it this way. In terms of the things that partake in largeness, or in smallness, it would seem that when something takes a part of the form that is, the example used earlier was of smallness, so we'll continue with that. The complaint was that if there's only part of a form that is within the thing of concern, then that part that is represented in the form of smallness is smaller than that which is small. And so how would it be the case if the part of something is smaller than the form of small, and so it can't really participate in it? So while I didn't really like this argument very much, it sheds a light on the potential difficulties of seeing the forms and the things that participate in them as parts. And so where we're at now is, how is it possible that things get some share or some part in the forms, if they can do so neither by getting parts nor by getting wholes? And the reason that they can't get the wholes is because the form itself is a type of purity. The thing in question, it could be anything, it could be a tablecloth, it could be a cat, it could be a human being, anything that participates in some form. The form that they participate in is usually in conjunction with others. That causes a certain level of dynamism. But there's a purity in which we understand that's associated with the form of man or the form of the feline. However, we can conceptualize that. And so, like I mentioned earlier, these are structural topics. And how exactly to conceptualize them? Are they only in mind? Or are they something that we can perceive tangibly? It can be quite difficult. We established last episode that the intelligible sphere, the intelligible domain, is not fixed to material dimensions. It's not fixed to a place, not fixed to a time. It doesn't have a length. It's not really something that can be measured in that way. It's something that can be seen by something that is conscious, aware, participatory. So to this, Socrates says, it's not an easy thing to determine how something may participate with a form, because it can't take a part of it, otherwise it reduces the purity of it. How does it maintain the purity of the form, again, without destroying it? How does it, how is it possible that it can't, well, I'll say this, how is it the case that the whole of the form is not something that we find when something participates in it? I suppose the answer is fairly obvious to that, because the form would destroy the identity. The identity is more than just the form that it participates in. So if I'm participating in the form of that which is good or that which is just, there are many things about me and my bodily makeup, my conscious experience, that don't necessarily fit with this form of goodness, but it doesn't mean that I'm not capable of it. It doesn't mean that I'm not good per se. But there's a complicated series of problems that we have to think through in order to have the forms be some sort of practical, usable framework. Now, Parmenides says, whenever some number of things seem to you to be large, perhaps there seems to be some one character, the same as you look at them all, and from that you conclude that the large is one. So how do we interpret this in greater detail? So we consider something to be large. And out of the number of them, of course they can't all be large. Well, I suppose they can be large, but of the things compared to each other, one is large and one is small. The character is within the relation, it would seem. This is something we also established on the first episode, that the forms do well to break this partiality conundrum by recognizing that within the relation among other things, that the purity and the unity of the form is maintained. What about the large itself and the other large things? If you look at them all in the same way with the mind's eye again, won't some one thing appear large, by which all these appear large? So the interpretation of this I find challenging, and the interpretation that I had of the previous, I'm not sure is quite spot on, but nonetheless I think we should move forward and see where this takes us. So again, what about the large itself? So the large itself is the form of that which is large. It is the purity of that which is large. And he says, and other large things. It's a strange way to express that. Other large things. So when we take one large thing and we say, okay, here's another large thing. So there's a similarity of largeness there that we can, by that relation, say that they are similarly large. If you look at them all in the same way with the mind's eye, what does this mean? Look at them all in the same way. It's possible that what he's referring to is that we are looking at it in terms of seeing the purity of the form and how it penetrates the oneness of the thing of concern, or maybe not the oneness of the thing, maybe it's the reverse. We look at the thing and we see how it participates in the oneness of the large. And so this is sort of a reversal, because we still have this sort of relativistic issue, but we are kind of solving the relational dilemma in the sense that we can a little bit farther now see that when we see things by their relations, we can see the form more clearly. Again, won't some one thing appear large, by which all these appear large? And so yes, some one thing appears large because we're identifying how the form of large, it participates in the form of largeness. And all of them appear large, even if one is smaller than the other, because we understand, perhaps in an expanded context compared to other things of a like nature or whatever, they are large. But there's more, I think, here than just that basic example. That if we look at other large things as well, we look at them and see the largeness that they possess. I may be off here, but I could think about myself versus my cat who is sitting right in front of me on this table. I can ask myself, how does this cat participate in the form of largeness? And there are various ways in which his size limits his capacity. There are various ways in which his size allows him to participate in the world. He is large enough to hunt for prey that are of a particular size, that are common to this area. And so we can see at least the form. We can see purity within all things, the purity of the form in all things. Again, I'm not sure if this is going where they are going, but I'm going to keep the thought nonetheless. So another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself, and the thing that partake of it. So another form of largeness. So I'm not sure about the grammar here, but I understand, I think, what he's getting at. Another form of largeness. So when we talk about the largeness within relation, it's not the identity of the form or the absolute purity of largeness that we are discussing. It is the way in which the purity of the form is participating in the thingness of nature. So another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself, and the things that partake of it. And in turn, another over all these, by which all of them will be large. Now I think that last part of the statement supports to a degree of where I am, and that is to say that within each thing it's possible to find that which is large because of its potential relation. Each of your forms will no longer be one, but unlimited in multitude. And they would be unlimited in multitude because, again, it's by their relation. There's always some relation that we can find for which it participates in that form. It's just a matter of scale. But Parmenides, maybe each of these forms is a thought. Now, I had this thought as well, and it's kind of a melancholic thought, at least it seems, because there is an idea, perhaps it's just an inclination in my mind, that the thoughts that I can have surely are false, potentially. And if this grand framework that we're trying to produce is just some thought, if the form is just some thought, then perhaps this is only something that is local to the human experience or to the human mind by the way it relates to reality. And perhaps that's true. And what's melancholic about it is that, at first glance at least, it appears to be something that is not connected to the divine. Now, I don't think this is necessarily true, but it's just an initial impulse. It's something that I want to monitor. And properly occurs only in minds. In this way, each of them might be one and no longer face the difficulties mentioned just now. I think it seems like there's still a multiplicity that one has to contend with, even if it's just within the mind. Parmenides says, what do you mean? Is each of the thoughts one, but a thought of nothing? And he says, of a thought of something rather than a thought of nothing. Of something that is. Isn't it of some one thing, that which thought thinks is over all the instances being some one character? So focusing on this last bit, isn't it of some one thing, which that thought thinks is over all the instances being some one character? So, some one thing. We have a focal point of attention. The oneness in question perhaps is the form, or rather, we're thinking about a thing. The thing is the thing that participates in a form. But also this thing could be the form. Isn't it of some one thing, which that thought thinks is over all the instances? So, like for example, the idea of largeness. The form itself is above everything. In mind, we can say that it exists. And since it is above everything, it has this singular quality. Then won't this thing that is thought to be one, being always the same over all the instances, be a form? And this is in line with what we've been thinking. It is always constant despite the relativism, and this is how it keeps its purity. If we can identify it through the chaos of the waters and the multiplicity among things, then we understand that we have some form. It's something that carries over. It maintains its identifiable nature. And what about this, says Parmenides? Given your claim that other things partake of forms, won't you necessarily think either that each thing is composed of thoughts, and all things think? So let's stop there. Given your claim that other things partake of forms. So there's perhaps a few thoughts that can be had here. One is that thingness, like I said, it's not the form. A thing can be a form, but the thing in this situation, it's beneath. It's something that participates in the form. And so we have all of these things that are seemingly separate from forms, but they don't necessarily have to be. For ease of conceptualization, momentarily, I think we can keep it that way. The thingness, and there are many things, there are a great many things of things in general. We think of things that are a mixture. And there are plenty of forms that are out there. And I happen to think that there is a graduated nature to this. That the forms themselves participate in a broader unity. But maybe let's not get there just yet. Now, the connection between things participating in forms and each thing being composed of thoughts is an interesting jump. Now, why necessarily then would Parmenides go there? Well, we have a relationship earlier on on the page, which has something to do with, there's an indication that the forms, as this structural ground, exists within mind as a useful tool. And that because it exists within mind, the conceptualization is composed of thoughts. And perhaps by extension, that because there is a mind that can see all of this, that it requires mind, I don't want to say to be, but it requires mind, I suppose, it requires thoughts in order to be. Maybe not requires mind in order to be. I'm not really sure exactly how to go about that. We know that all things don't think in the way that we think of thinking. And so it's not really broaching this broad thinking topic. Or that, he continues, although they are thoughts, they are unthinking. And Socrates says that isn't reasonable. What appears most likely to me is these forms are like patterns set in nature, and other things resemble them and are likenesses. So let's try our best to understand Parmenides here. Now, of Parmenides' statement, we can say, if forms are thoughts, things are thoughts, because things participate in them. If forms are thoughts, things contain thoughts. These are the two potentials. So we know so far that forms are intelligible structures. We could say that they are independent of mind if we want to escape this trap. But they're accessible through the seeing mind. Are they only accessible this way? I don't know. But they are neither mental nor physical things. We've already been through this. The danger of placing dimension into this domain. And we spoke of earlier about the forms being conditions of intelligibility, not thoughts. And so Socrates again, he says, forms are like patterns set in nature. So a pattern set in nature is something that the mind can see. I suppose it can have a place, but the place doesn't really matter. What matters are the conditions of nature that make the pattern visible. And other things resemble them and are likenesses. And this partaking of the forms is, for the other things, simply being modeled on them. So let's reframe this, try to understand it a little bit better. Now the second part of the Socrates' statement, and other things resemble them and are likenesses. So the patterns in nature, again the conditions. Many things resemble these conditions because all the conditions are necessary for things to participate in forms. He says, this partaking of the forms is, for the other things, simply being modeled on them. The partaking of the forms. This is drawing the purity. The other things. This language is a bit confusing, but the other things could just indicate anything that's not necessarily on top of mind, or something that includes multiplicity and thingness in general. Now, the modeling is the way in which the characteristics of the pattern of nature are expressed on the substrate that they are afforded, it would seem. Alright, so today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Today is a day that I'm thankful for, not for any particular reason, but because there's a positive feeling in my heart, and for these moments I have to be thankful, because it's not always this way. So I'm glad also to have a day's rest, because I found it a bit difficult near the end of last episode to conceptualize the forms any longer. But I come back to it now with a greater sense of where we were and where to move forward. So I want to perhaps go over a familiar surface again. We're almost done with this page, but I want to make sure it's a thought to completion. And what about this, said Parmenides, given your claim that other things partake of forms, won't you necessarily think either that each thing is composed of thoughts, and all things think, or that although they are thoughts, they are unthinking? Now we have to remember from earlier, Socrates said that each form is a thought. There's a direct equivalence. And going to what Parmenides said, given your claim that other things partake of forms, given that other things partake of thoughts, won't you necessarily think that each thing is composed of thoughts, and all things think, or that although they are thoughts, they are unthinking? So my object here is to nail down more comprehensively the direct link that Parmenides is drawing to Socrates' statement. I understand it to a degree, but I haven't made this sort of explicit in my mind. That's why I'm stopping here. So if I imagine this form, this thing that is in part conceptual, it's not agentic, it's structural for sure. It is something that is an undergirding for the possibility for being to exist. Again, this structure it's a form of order and organization. It is something that is seen through the eyes of the mind, not the literal eyes or the physical eyes, though it can be as well. Patterns in nature, Socrates will mention shortly, has some to do with it. And so while we stay in this sort of cloudy space, I want to bring this down to a degree of certainty, or greater certainty. Now, of course, we know that we're not going to stay here. We know that we are not going to say that the forms are just thoughts. But we have to ask ourselves the question, if we think about this in this way, we think about the mind, and we think about the mind's ordering of things that it sees. There's plenty of talk these days about the mind as this structure that creates an elaborate illusion about what it experiences. In earlier dialogues, I've called this sort of a step-down function. It's a step removed from real reality, let's say. And by our limited senses, we build within our minds our best conception of what it is based on what we have at our disposal. Much of this processing and much of this creation is outside of our control. It is natural. It is sort of there's a lot of software that it's running in the background. More of these higher level processing is something that is seen to be reflective, self-orienting. Now, I don't wish to limit my thinking here, but this is often the general sentiment, I think, of what we hear in the contemporary age. It's useful to a degree, I think, philosophically, because there's a certain way in which this step-down function, or this illusion of reality that we participate in, is accurate. And what we are saying here about the forms is not too far off from that. But if we were to say that the only thing, or rather, if we are to say that because the mind is imperfectly seeing reality, that either we cannot rely on it, or that it is somehow not worthy of integration into some formal system of knowledge, I think that this would be a great mistake. So what am I getting at here? If the form is to be this structure of being, of how it comes to be, that there are these purities for which we can identify sort of a stability, an undergirding stability of identity. Again, it's a stability that is structural, like a load-bearing beam is for a house. If these are to be thoughts, we are to understand that that which participates in it receives from it thinking material. And this is sort of where Parmenides goes, I think, is to say, well, if it receives this, then perhaps all things have some sort of thoughtful base to them. Or perhaps they occupy a space that the thoughtful creature does, and yet doesn't exercise the same capacity. And Socrates says that this isn't reasonable. What most likely happens is that these forms are likely patterns set in nature. So we're moving away from this conscious definition of the forms, or the thinking, the forms as thoughts. Now he's using a different definition, and he's using a likeness. He's not saying the forms are patterns in nature, but they are like patterns in nature. Now what is a pattern in nature that we can observe? The sun rising, the sun setting, the wind blowing, the birds chirping. There are many things that we can observe in nature, many patterns. All of these, we call them things. Things that are participating in some way with something. Socrates says, and other things resemble them and are likenesses. Now, let's say the mother's love for a son. This we could say is a likeness. The love is a likeness to the purity of that love that it participates in. But it's given distinct characteristics and qualities that are unique to those things that participate in it. And he says, and this partaking of the forms is, for the other things, simply being modeled on them. And so this farther hits home the idea that the forms are something of a playground that one participates in to receive whatever it is that that form has to offer. So we've reached the next page. I want to read this in its entirety and then continue. If something resembles the form, he said, can that form not be like what has been modeled on it, to the extent that the thing has been made like it? Or is there any way for something like to be like what is not like it? There is not. And isn't there a compelling necessity for that which is like to partake of the same one form as what is like it? There is. But if like things are like by partaking in something or of something, won't that be the form itself? Undoubtedly. Therefore, nothing can be like the form, nor can the form be like anything else. Otherwise, alongside the form, another form will always make its appearance, and if that form is like anything, yet another. And if the form proves to be like what partakes of it, a fresh form will never cease emerging. That's very true. So other things don't get a share of the forms by likeness. We must seek some other means by which they get a share. So it seems. Then do you see, Socrates, he said, how great the difficulty is if one marks things off as forms themselves by themselves? Quite clearly. I assure you, he said, that you do not yet, if I may put it so, have an inkling of how great the difficulty is if you are going to posit one form in each case every time you make a distinction among things. How so? He asked. There are many other reasons, Parmenides said, but the main one is this. Suppose someone were to say that if the forms are such as we claim that they must be, they cannot even be known. If anyone should raise that objection, you wouldn't be able to show him that he is wrong, unless the objector happened to be widely experienced and not ungifted, and consented to pay attention while in your effort to show him you dealt with many distant considerations. Otherwise, the person who insists that they are unnecessarily unknowable would remain unconvinced. Why is that, Parmenides? Socrates asked. Because I think that you, Socrates, and anyone else who posits that there is for each thing some being itself by itself would agree, to begin with, that none of those beings is in us. Yes. How could it still be itself by itself, replied Socrates. Very good, said Parmenides. And so all the characters that are what they are in relation to each other have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. And whether one posits the latter as likenesses or in some other way, it is by partaking of them that we come to be called by their various names. These things that belong to us, although they have the same names as the forms, are in their turn what they are in relation to themselves, but not in relation to the forms. And all the things named in this way are of themselves, but not of the forms. So that is our next page that we have to go through. Okay, so let's begin with this. If something resembles the form, he said, can that form not be like what has been modeled on it? So we're thinking about any old object or person, it doesn't matter. And I think there ought to be an implication that within this thing, whatever it is, the particular, is an expression of the form, because we are seeing we're seeing the purity of the thing within a mixture or a substrate, an imitation, a likeness, whatever language we want to use. I think they can all be used. Can that form not be like what has been modeled on it? I think it's possible that there is that which is unlike within this situation, where a form can be, something can participate in a form without really being like the purity of the thing. But it can't be so far away from it that you would be unable to recognize as intelligible the form. Otherwise, I don't really think it would be practical to speak about it in that way. To the extent that the thing has been made like it. So again, can that form not be like what has been modeled on it, to the extent that the thing has been made like it? So I may have confused myself a little bit here, because he begins by saying, if something resembles the form, now this is a little bit more difficult, because again, the form, the purity of the thing that sits at the center, so to speak, is an intelligible structure. And so that, by its very nature, the intelligible structure affords the being of the form, or affords being in general. I'm not really sure how to articulate that. And so, if likeness is not to be within the equation of the thing or of the particulate that participates in the form, then how is it possible that we can see the unity in something that denies it? Again, to the extent that the thing has been made like it. And so it would seem that it's impossible for this to occur. Or is there any way for something like it to be like what it is not like? There is not. They continue, and isn't there a compelling necessity for that which is like to partake of the same one form as what it is like. Of course, this is the truth, because likeness is that relationship. Likeness. I spoke earlier about relationality, trying not to get lost in relativism, and I think we might be moving past that. What I had to say earlier, but still elements of it remain, in the sense that the relationship among things are extremely important. And as I said at the outset, in order to understand the forms better, we have to understand the relationship between the forms and the particulars. Again, the particular would be me, and the form would be of man, or of the human being. And isn't there a compelling necessity for that which is to partake of the same one form as what it is like? The necessity is there within the relation, because the necessity of likeness preserves the unification of the form and the expression of the particular as it participates in it. But if like things are like by partaking of something, won't that be the form itself? I would have to wonder about this, because the particulars have their own qualities. They are imperfect, they are mixtures, and the forms are purities. Now, of course, there has to be some way in which this angelic sort of thread reaches into something. Now, angelic thread, I don't mean to imply agency here, but there is a thread of order that preserves unification. And this is obviously something that can be seen. And so, I'm thinking about my participation at work. Or perhaps my participation in the form of expertise that I have. It's not the case that as I participate in the form when I'm at work, that I am fully expertise, the expert of this thing. I participate in it, and so I have a share, and the share is not partial, it is a reception of the unity into an imperfect system. There's no way that I can understand all things as it relates to my expertise. The field itself, as it exists, does not even possess this. It shares in the form, it participates in the form, of course. That's why it's an intelligible form of expertise. And I think I understand that there is a way in which we can say, when something is done rightly or well, or something is just, then of course it partakes in justice. And we can see that unity expressed there. But it would be a stretch to say that of the particular, when it participates in this form, that it becomes the form. Now, I could be incorrect about this. This is something that I have to think about more. The share is certainly the form itself. share in the relation. Therefore, nothing can be like the form, nor can the form be like anything else. Now, why is this the case? Well, this is probably because if it's completely that way, if I partake in an expertise and then I somehow become the expertise, then the form would be diluted by my mixture. The form would be changed, or I would be changed. There would be a destruction of something. The relationship would not hold. An absence of two things to be related to each other, of course, it's impossible to have that relation if one becomes the other. Otherwise, alongside the form, another form will always make its appearance. And if that form is like anything, yet another, and if the form proves to be like what partakes of it, a fresh form will never cease emerging. So it's like this sort of the experience of multiple mirrors, in which the image just keeps on repeating and repeating and repeating into infinity, or what seems like infinity. I had this experience when I was younger. My parents had this strange closet, if you can call it a closet, I'm not really sure. It was part of a bathroom, in which there was these sliding doors that had mirrors on them. And when all these doors were closed, it was like in a square room. So I guess it was like a closet. You could see this repeating pattern over and over and over again. And this is sort of what I think. On one level, it's not the form that you started with. It's another image. It's a different image. It's not unified. And it's hard to consolidate based on that. So other things don't get a share of the forms by likeness. We must seek some other means by which they get a share. So this is an interesting conception. I want to go back to the idea of love. A mother's love for the son, or love in a family. Because again, love in a family can stretch the particulars of a family, can seemingly participate in the form differently than other things. But nonetheless, the structure is there to be participated in. The particulars are beautiful in the way that they can express what the form has to, what the intelligible structure has to offer. And so I think, as far as I can understand, this likeness, this equivalence of the purity as it enters into, or as it rather, I shouldn't say it in this way, starting with the particulars, as it participates in the intelligible structure of love. What we are contending now is that the likeness, the image, the mirror, is not the form itself. It's the expression of the form. And so when we say likeness, if we mean likeness to mean that there is a true share in the purity, then perhaps the implication is that this purity, or the form itself, would, or the particular would be consumed by the purity of the form, rather than just remain particular, but an illustration or a mirror image of the form. Therefore, nothing can be like the form, nor can the form be like anything else. Otherwise, alongside the form will always make its appearance. And if that form is like anything, yet another, and if the form proves to be like what partakes of it, a fresh form will never cease from emerging. So other things don't get a share of the forms by likeness. We must seek some other means by which they get a share. And perhaps my reflection here is a little bit off. Because what I am saying is that potentially the participation in the form if it is to take that purity, then that purity cannot be erased. It is something that's foundational, it's the structural. And so it competes, or rather it does not allow a symbiosis with the particular. But maybe this isn't on the right track. I think perhaps earlier I was on a better path. The key, but if like things are like by partaking of something, won't that be the form itself? So there is this element, the partaking, and also the idea that this sharing of likeness causes something of the foundational structure to be endowed within the particular. And so the particular then becomes the form. And this moves infinitely. So I think there is a relationship, if it's not the same thing, than what I said earlier. I think it went around that merry-go-round again. Now it seems to make sense to me. So other things don't get a share of the forms by likeness. We must seek some other means by which we get a share. Then do you see, Socrates, he said, how great the difficulty is if one marks things off as forms, themselves, by themselves? Quite clearly, Socrates replies. I assure you, he said, that you do not yet, if I may put it so, have an inkling of how great the difficulty is if you are going to posit one form in each case every time you make a distinction among things. So let's pick apart these two. Further reflecting on this likeness situation and getting a share. So what we are talking about is exactly where we should be. We're talking about the relationship between the structure, which is the forms, the intelligible structure. It is in part the way in which our minds understand and relate to reality. It is the way in which being relates to other forms of being. It gives cause, I think, for being in general. And so now that which is intelligible likeness of such a broad, complicated, and yet, I'm sure, simplistic or foundational seems so difficult and so foreign to me, where I feel like it should not be. Now, we've already established how this potential likeness can lead to this sort of infinite digression down into the particulars. And if we do that, of course, we don't really have a unification. Maybe perhaps we have a unification based on the first thing, the first cause. But still, there's an indication somehow that these likenesses are not sufficient. So I think we have to pause for a moment and really hammer this in, because it doesn't seem like I have a decent enough grasp on it to move on. I think the principal issue has to do with the term likeness. Now, the definition of likeness from Google is the fact or quality of being alike, resemblance, the semblance, guise, or outward appearance of, a portrait of representation. Now, in my mind, there's a difficulty of separating out the fact or quality of being alike and the other two sort of sub-definitions, a portrait or representation. Now, of course, there is a big difference between the Mona Lisa and Mona Lisa. The image is a reflection of the more pure form. The image participates in the form of Mona Lisa, let's say. If somehow Mona Lisa, it wouldn't make any sense, of course, this is why we can't have the argument. If Mona Lisa, if she was painted, that the form of herself would be in the painting, that she would somehow live there and have this sort of separate experience there, then perhaps we could say that the form has extended there. But of course, that's not going to happen. It's impossible. But I think in that way, that type of sharing of likeness causes at least myself to see how there is this incongruency or potential incongruency. Now, on the other hand, when we think of something that is like, the fact or quality of being like, there are plenty of things about Mona Lisa and the painting the Mona Lisa that are alike. It's a representation, after all. And so they have this shared aspect of a superficial quality, but it's not a full sharing. And so it's not likeness in the purity sense, but it's a likeness in the way that there is a relationship at the very least. There has to be a relationship. So I take a bit of issue with the definition, but I think we'll have to move on for the moment. So we're looking elsewhere for this share in the form. And I think it has to be a little bit more fundamental than just a factor of quality or a resemblance. Participation, I think, is a good word. I'm not sure where you're going to go, but it has an idea or a quality of sharing, of taking part in. I suppose we can ask then, how is a particular afforded a participation in the form? But much like the painter that is responsible for moving the the form of Mona Lisa to the painted version, there is not necessarily an agentic underlying frame, and we'll get to that sort of thing eventually. Well, maybe not in the dialogue, but another reflection surely. But it's not necessarily needed here. The point is more, like I said, structural. And that while we may find some divine order and cause within this relational structure, the forms, as we consider them, I think are sort of like maybe not mechanistic, but in the sense that one gear turns and the other turns from it by the other's turning, I think is sort of what we're after, because it's the intelligible causes that give rise to being. So next we get into the argument that Parmenides brings up about this potential person saying that the forms are unknowable, or there's a person that raises the potential objection that the forms are unknowable because they occupy a place for which they are within themselves by themselves. Now, what we've read before this in the Sophists, we understand that this is something that we've moved past. We understand that there is a relational structure among things, and that nothing can really be by itself. There always is this relationship, that there is a reception and there is a giving in terms of being. It's one of the ways that non-being can exist at all, because being is not just an isolated thing or experience. It is something that is highly differentiated. There is unification, there's multiplicity, there is change, there is renewal, there is death. There is all of this that exists within that domain of being. But what stays constant, I think, is this relational structure, such that one thing must be related to another thing to maintain its own being. And in this way, being becomes knowable, or the forms become knowable. And it's not so much a matter of thinking about the forms as something, some intelligible item separate from everything else. There is, much like plants that feed off of the earth, there is this, or maybe rather I should say the seeds that are planted into the earth. What grows from the forms are forms of particulars and mixture. The forms themselves, I think, are related to other forms. They're connected by something. They're connected by a relational framework. That thing, I think, is when we sort of approach the divine. Where we are now is more basic. It's just an intelligible framework, intelligible structure. Now Parmenides says, anyone else who posits that there is for each thing some being itself by itself would agree, to begin with, that none of those beings is in us. And this is, I think, fairly straightforward. If it is something that is so closed off, it cannot have a relation to other things. So the form itself has to be more of a dynamic thing. So far, we've been approaching this very rigidly. And I think we have to, because we're talking about concepts of unification and purity. And so, much like a city, much like our own minds, to maintain a sense of identity and to, in some sense, to resist change, to maintain whatever thing that is to have a degree of constancy, a degree of purity of whatever ground holds that being. But at the same time, the relational framework is such that it affords the being continual renewal and rebirth. And so there's a unique participation here that we have to uncover and understand, so we can really gain the insights that come from this intelligible framework. Now Parmenides continues and he says, and so all the characters that are what they are in relation to each other have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. So it seems we're continuing in the path of the former, away from where my mind is leading myself, I guess. And what I mean by that is I'm resistant to this idea that things can exist in themselves by themselves. I have no problem with identity, and I have no problem with maintaining purity. But if we don't have this relational pressure valve, I have a hard time understanding how we participate in the forms at all. And this goes back to what they said earlier about it wouldn't be intelligible if it was not something that we could relate to. So again, when Parmenides mentions these characters, I think about traits that define a thing. And we could say that it could be a thing, it could be a person. A person is a thing, I suppose. Or a person. A thing is more general. And so these traits are fundamental. They're fundamental aspects of uniqueness. They maintain the identity of the thing. And so he mentions these characters, these fundamental building blocks, that are what they are in relation to other things, have their being in relation to themselves. So this is kind of a confusing statement, it would seem. That are what they are in relation to each other. So there is this hint about where I am going, because there's the relational structure, obviously. They are what they are in relation to each other. But then he says, have their being in relation to themselves. So I think that there is this quality, this aspect of non-being that differentiates, and by this differentiation there is a relationship that is created. There must be. And so that's why there is this, they are what they are in relation to each other, and then there seems to be this sort of gap, and then there's have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. Like the traits that make up that identity are separate from the traits that make up our identity. But there is a relationship. And so what I hunger for is what this is. So I want to expand on this idea that the traits of one identity are separate from the traits of the other, as it relates to the forms, and then as it relates to us, or the particulars, everything that participates in the forms. Now, today happens to be a new day, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time gathering my thoughts. And I was thinking that just a little bit earlier from where we are now, I want to remind us that Parmenides said, how great the difficulty is if one marks things off as forms themselves by themselves. He sort of reproves Socrates, saying that you don't yet know how difficult a task it is if you're going to posit one form in each case every time you make a distinction among things. And then he goes into this idea of this hypothetical person, perhaps that's learned, who may go along and listen to how this may unfold, but for the majority, they're going to remain unconvinced. And this has to do with the idea that the forms are unknowable. And we've touched on this earlier. And the idea is brought up that for each thing, some being itself by itself, that none of those beings is in us. So right here, I think there's a statement to be said about the nature of the forms, because it's a relational one. We're saying that the way that we are constituted is by relation. I think that there's a correct approach here. And he reiterates, he being a Parmenides, and he says, so all the characters that are what they are in relation to each other, at their being in relation to themselves, but again, the implication is that the forms are beings within themselves, or itself by itself. And this is something that I found to be inconsistent, because it's ontologically schemic. It cannot exist on its own. So the forms are these things of purity that are because of themselves. Now, it would make sense if we, these relational beings that participate in the forms, are participating in something that is infinite in a way, always there for growth. It's like an infinite soil for which possibility, purpose, intelligibility can be caused, can be set into motion. All the characters that are what they are in relation to each other have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. So again, two domains. One is the step down, the particular, and one is that of the forms, that of the pure, that of the strongly held identity, of the stable. We can put it in these words. Forms relate to one another in the intelligible order. Being to same, same to different, different to motion, motion to rest. Particulars relate to one another in the sensible order. Bigger than, smaller than, older than, more loving than. And so I think where I get tripped up is the way in which the language of Parmenides seems to deny this word relationship. And I think participation is better. I think it's still a form of relation, but the point being here is that what is being separated is the dimensional relationality, the classical dimensional relationality that we would consider like space-time, etc. And the structure that undergirds its expression. And we could think of a couple examples, I suppose. One would be the shadow of a person. The shadow is the particular. It's a step down from the thing that is more pure, or that which is. And that which is would be whatever is casting the shadow, the object, the person, whatever. And so while there is no physical, I suppose there's a physical relationship in the absolute sense of the analogy, but there's no physical relationship in terms of their contact. It's rather that the shadow is grounded within the thing that casts it. The thing that casts it is necessary for its being. So I want to read this again. And so all the characters that are what they are in relation to each other have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. And whether one posits the latter as likenesses or in some other way, it is by partaking of them that they come to be called by their various names. So there's the partaking or the participation. And so we have to get away from this idea of agentic meeting, that there are two different worlds that are coming into contact with each other by this force of will. It's rather the structure. It is the meaning of the words that I speak, and the difference between that meaning and my verbal articulation, which has all of the physical causes in the world that can be explained to it. The meaning is the underlying intelligible structure, and our minds are there to see it. These things that belong to us, although they have the same names as the forms, are in their turn what they are in relation to themselves, but not in relation to the forms, and all the things named in this way are of themselves, but not of the forms. And so I think that what is articulated here is something that we reflected on a moment ago. So Parmenides continues, and he goes farther. What do you mean? Socrates asks. Take an example, said Parmenides. If one of us is somebody's master, or somebody's slave, he is surely not a slave of master itself, of what a master is, nor is a master of slave itself, of what a slave is. On the contrary, being a human being, he is a master or slave of a human being. Mastery itself, on the other hand, is what it is of slavery itself. And in the same way, slavery itself is slavery of mastery itself. Things in us do not have their power in relation to forms, nor do they have theirs in relation to us. But, I repeat, forms are what they are of themselves in relation to themselves, and things that belong to us are, in the same way, what they are in relation to themselves. Do you understand what I mean? Certainly, Socrates said, I understand. So too, he said, knowledge itself. What knowledge is, would be knowledge of that truth itself, which is what truth is? Certainly. Furthermore, each particular knowledge, what it is, would be knowledge of some particular thing, of what that thing is. Isn't that so? Yes. But wouldn't knowledge that belongs to us of the truth that belongs to our world? And wouldn't it follow each particular knowledge that belongs to us in turn knowledge of some particular thing in our world? Necessarily. But, as you agree, we neither have the forms themselves nor can they belong to us. Yes, you're quite right. And surely the kinds themselves, which each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself. Yes. The very thing that we don't have. No, we don't. So none of the forms is known by us, because we don't partake of knowledge itself. It seems not. Then the beautiful itself, what it is, cannot be known by us, nor can the good, nor, indeed, can any of the things we take to be characters themselves. It looks that way. Here's something even more shocking than that. What's that? Surely you would say that if in fact there is knowledge, a kind itself, it is much more precise than is knowledge that belongs to us. And the same goes for beauty and all others. Alright, so I wanted to have that read, but today is a new day, and I want to have a bit of a reflection on things. And my desire to do this is because I've been feeling of late a bit disconnected and disjointed. So I want to start this with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I thank you for this time to orient attention. I thank you that for all of experience and the events that happen throughout the days and throughout the week, that even if there is that point at which I feel lost in this sea of chaotic potential and vast amount of information to attend to, I am thankful again for this moment to reorient and recenter on that which is good and that which is divine, sobering in the sense that it sheds light on purpose and meaning and the goodness therein. And Lord, I'm thankful today for the experiences that I've had. I'm thankful for perhaps even the confusion, as now I have time to think about it and reflect on different social situations that I've been engaged in and my behavior and my response to certain things. All of these, I know, will in some way be an aspect of this discussion today. And with this, I am thankful. And I pray that this is something that serves you. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So, my cat happened to walk past the microphone just now. A good end to the prayer, perhaps. So I want to get into a discussion of being. I mentioned that today there was some interesting social experiences, and I am always somebody that has been a bit quiet and reserved. Sometimes the reserve and the lack of speech is because of its disturbance and attention caused by an anxious heart. Sometimes it's more because there isn't much happening by way of thoughts and desires to communicate. Other times it's not an issue at all, but I've noticed that there are these times in my experience. And often when they happen, I find myself thinking about them and wondering why. And often there is this sort of laxity of thought, and perhaps I can even say laxity of experience. And the question why never really gets sufficiently answered. And when I asked myself why today, my mind went to the definition of being for some reason. And the thought occurred to me when I was driving home that while I spend so much time thinking about being and about orientation, pure definitions tend to escape me, and I feel so silly in these instances because I know I can come to some conclusion about something, but it's frustrating to be so apprehensive about a definition. And so I want to talk about being, perhaps where we've come so far in my understanding of what being is, and then move on from there. Much like the forms, I think being is something that is foundational, is something that is. We can classify it in a way as information. An information that has a certain aspect, a grounded aspect to it. I don't restrict it to the material. I don't restrict it to the intelligible. There seems to be, well, I suppose there's different ways to approach this. Of the intelligible, I think we can say quite a lot. And it depends on a matter of belief where we are in that landscape. I believe that we are in an intelligible landscape. And I think that this intelligibility is afforded by something that sees. We can see because something else has seen and has put forth that the creative process, creative energy to produce something to be seen. Now, I can't speak necessarily on the way in which what I described as the thing that is responsible for the intelligible landscape, for exactly how it is. But in the probabilities of life, in the small, the great, perhaps, odds, or the smallness of the likelihood of the present being, that is my existence, my human existence, and my mind and my sight, limited and fallacious as it may be, finds itself in a place of what we would call being, of existence. And it's interesting to me that being is something that extends beyond just awareness. There are plenty of things that are. There are plenty of things that have an apparent identity. And yet, it all seems to communicate with each other. I can't say that the whole thing is conscious, but I can say that I believe that the whole thing is threaded. Different aspects participate in different ways. There may appear to be uncertainty, absence, chaos in much of it, but also, to the degree that we can, there are plenty of beautiful things to be seen, plenty of good things to be seen, and that, as a matter of attention, seeing these things supports a particular belief, stimulates particular productive courage and discipline of mind. And it is within this grounding of being that I think there are elements of that which is responsible for it. And as we attend to it, we see it more clearly. We identify it with it more purely. Now, as we go through this dialogue, I just want to put out a reminder that there is meant to be confusion, or rather struggle, with particular concepts. And while it is not against the rules, so to speak, of reflection, to give this sort of perpetual input and to defend one's own beliefs, it would become a burden if all this reflection was a defense of what I believe, without trying to challenge myself. And of late, I believe that I've been making progress in terms of understanding the forms. But the mixture that comes from the mature Platonic thinking and the dialogue, such as the Sophist, and even in the Statesman, we've moved ourselves back a step. And in this step, there is confusion, because we're dealing with different ideas that perhaps don't align. And when thinking on large topics, it can be easy to be lost or to get lost. And while I understand that this is not the Bible, I hunger for that orientation, for God's presence and God's grace. And as a reminder to myself, I wish this to be on the top of mind. So even if memory fails me day to day, there's truth and beauty to be found almost everywhere. Even in uncertainty, there can be some conclusion, even if it is not the conclusion that we are after. And perhaps what we are after is ill-defined anyway. I think part of the difficulty understanding of where we are and what Parmenides is trying to do is that I've been thinking too minimally in terms of conscious dimensions. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we are to take the material world and the word dimension and apply it there, we apply all of the different tools that we have to measure that material reality. So we take a ruler to measure length and width. And in terms of our fundamental dimensions, length being one, mass, time, electric current, thermodynamic temperature, amount of substance, luminous intensity. And we build on these things. We have derived dimensions: area, volume, velocity, acceleration, force, energy, pressure, density. But of course I say conscious dimensions, so I'm not referring to those things. What I'm referring to almost is like what Socrates is speaking about here. So when I say that I'm working in 2 dimensions, my apologies, but today is a new day, so I think I understand what I was getting at yesterday. So 2 cognitive dimensions, potentially. I think that one of these dimensions would be the particular. It's something that I've been calling the mixture. I'm not sure if that's correct or not. and the other is that of the forms, that of the purified, the unified. I want to say something about identity, but so far what we've been saying is that there is the identity of identities, that it is within itself. And this is something that I've struggled with in this dialogue, because earlier we've come up with potential solutions to the way out of that, because the maintenance of the idea or the belief that the relations among things are important for their ontological expression, or their orientation, the grounding for what they are. But again, this raises obvious questions. How can it be the case that something exists independent of all other identity? It would seem that, while I don't deny the thread that holds the thing together, and much like our experience, this thread that holds everything together may seem infinite in its reflective capacity. It may have an agency that we can see. At the very least, it plays upon our minds, and we can see it unfold every day. Its expression all the time different. And yet, certain forms that we recognize of it, we participate with it, and we get better from it. And although we're not necessarily getting into any divine territory with regard to what Socrates and Parmenides are talking about, they're talking about, they're taking sort of an engineer's, or maybe not an engineer's perspective, but in a certain sense, that the engineer is concerned with the practical and concerned with the rational. Not that those that are not engineers are not. But I say this to say that sometimes the mind needs to shift away from the broad, grand image and think about the practical parts, the practical steps. Over time, something builds into that sort of thing. And so this concept and this idea of the forms, it's an intelligible framework. It's a structure by which the mind relates things. Now here I say relate. And I think it's an apt term. Because how do we relate? And when I say we, I mean in the essence of who we are, the subject, the I-ness of who we are. How does that relate to all that it can perceive? A fairly simple question, a straightforward question. But again, it's at that foundational level. And on these foundations, there are interesting things. Again, there's this pull that I have after coming out of the Bible to go there. But this is not a metaphysical exploration at the moment. This is a different type of exercise. Now, that's not to say that there are not metaphysical attributes to this. Of course, the intelligible sphere, there's a metaphysical feeling that I get from it. And yet, Socrates is playing with this idea of relating this to the subject. Is it only by our experience? Is it only in thoughts? Now, as far as So trying to get back into this now. As far as the difficulty with distinctions, this is the point that Parmenides raises. He says that Socrates is going to have quite the difficulty making a distinction or a form every time he makes a distinction among things. So let's say this is a pretty common one, but the difference between a table and a chair, two of which I'm articulating with right now. On one hand, surely there is a form of a chair and a form of a table. That the chair participates in that form, that eventually a poor participation would lead to such an object being considered as unable to participate in that purpose. The same goes with the table. Now, from Parmenides' perspective, I think he's following rationally in Socrates' argument. He gives the hypothetical. Well, perhaps there's a person that's going to say that they cannot follow you because the forms are ultimately unknowable, and that is because there is a purity of the form that is always separate. Maybe not purity is not the right word. The form remains separate from the thing that participates in it, because it is a thing by itself, in itself, for itself, let's say. Of course, there's an inconsistency by the very fact that something participates in a form. And it seems to be the case that where we have moved is away from that. At least we've questioned it. How can it be the case that a form can be by itself by itself? And so we're still in this sort of liminal transjective state, it would seem. But we're at this place where the characters in the intelligible sphere have their relations to one another, but with regard to us, wherever us is, the level of particulars, we don't share this. But of course we do. We participate in it. So there's an inconsistency that we have not yet gotten to. And so we come again to this section of the dialogue that I found perpetually difficult to grasp. And he says, and whether one posits the latter as likenesses or in some other way. So the latter being likely the particulars, the latter involving things in relation to things that belong to us. He says, it is by partaking of them that we come to be called by their various names. By partaking of them, he means the forms. But what still is uncertain is this likeness or some other way. What he's pointing his finger at is the relation. It is by partaking of them that we come to be called by their various names. These things that belong to us, although they have the same names as the forms, are in their turn what they are in relation to themselves, but not in relation to the forms. Now, of course, this cannot be the case if they indeed participate in the forms, because they have received something. They have received the base level intelligibility of their being from the forms. These things that belong to us, although they have the same names as the forms, are in their turn what they are in relation to themselves, but not in relation to the forms, and all the things named in this way are of themselves, but not of the forms. So I think we have to do a little bit of thinking about what necessarily it means to be of a form, or to be of, rather, themselves, of its own being. I think at the root of this we have identity, which is that thing that is specific or particular to some object of difference. And by object of difference, I mean that it is something that is marked out or has a boundary set around it that makes it distinct and different from other things. And here I have to think about intelligibility, because this is essentially the effect of that queen, the queen's influence, that she has her pawns of difference, and they surround this reality, dividing things, separating them out into their own separate identities. And yet, much like a map, it is not for us to say that because we can identify the ocean that is separate from the continents, or a country that is separate from another, that all of this, by their separation, means that we have divided the earth in a way that is irreparable. Now the earth is no longer something that can be considered as a whole. I hope I'm not too far off with this analogy, but I think that there is something here, in the sense that it's obvious that the earth stays as it is. The way in which it's carved up depends on difference. It depends on the intelligible structure that differentiates things. And there are many qualities that go into this differentiation. All things named in this way are of themselves, but not of the forms. And again, we have to reiterate, what does he mean by named in this way? These things that belong to us. And what is this? These things that belong to us. I wish he was a little bit more descriptive here. But I'm guessing that he means maybe characteristics, qualities, perhaps. Identities, maybe, things that belong to us. He could be imagining the mind as it considers the intelligible landscape that's in front of it. And as a matter of belonging, we can consider many objects to be ours: the table, the chair. A name, I think, can easily be and can go along with this. That the name is sort of this reflection It may not in and of itself be the form, because it's likely a step down from the form. But nonetheless, it is something of ours. It's something that we know intimately and participate with it. Now, Parmenides says, take an example. If one of us is somebody's master or somebody's slave, he is surely not a slave or master itself. And this is clear, as we've established earlier, that there is a formal distinction about what the slave is and what the master is. If one of us is somebody's master or somebody's slave, he is surely not a slave or master itself of what a master is, nor is the master a master of slave itself, of what a slave is. And so they are neither the form nor, by their relation to the other identity that participates in a different form than their own, they do not become master or slave to that other thing. That other thing being the other form. On the contrary, being a human being, he is a master or slave of a human being. And so we have this step down, this reality that is not of the totalizing formal quality of the terms that we use to see reality. Mastery itself, on the other hand, is what it is of slavery itself. Now, what does he mean by this? Mastery itself, on the other hand, is what it is of slavery itself. In the same way, slavery itself is slavery of mastery itself. Now here I think he's talking about the intelligible, that of the formal, that of the specifics as they relate to the form of mastery or of slavery. Now the two of these are related to each other, of course, but they are not related to each other in the particulars, as in the case of the human being. They are related to each other as in the case of the forms, as in the formal domain. Things in us do not have their power in relation to forms. So this is an important statement. I'm not sure how to feel about this or how to interpret this. Things in us do not have their power in relation to the forms. So first of all, what does it mean by power? By power, I think, in a sense at least, ownership. Maybe more fundamentally, participation in. That there is some stake of identity involved in that relationship. That this power is an aspect of being. But power does seem to suggest participation, because within power there's this either potential or active spirit within it. Things in us do not have their power in relation to forms. Now, of course, if the formal or intelligible domain is just that, it's just a structure by which the mind is operating to see reality, and it really doesn't have a stronger bearing, what we might call an objective bearing, then of course it would seemingly make sense that since these things are not really external to us, or rather, since these things are not something that we can participate in because of where we are, who we are, then this power, whatever that means, is relegated to the particular domains of the formal or of the particular. Nor do they have theirs in relation to us. But, I repeat, forms are what they are of themselves and in relation to themselves. Now, before we move on, I suppose it's worth mentioning, for purposes of reiteration, that much like us in the realm of particulars, these forms participate with other forms. So, earlier I said this business about the relationality among things, and that's impossible to have something existing without having a relationship to something. Otherwise it would become ischemic, and it would not be able to prosper. They need this thing, or being needs difference, and it needs continual articulation, this sort of changing gears of reality to keep it in motion. Now there's more there, of course, I think that we can explore, but that would get us farther away, a distraction from where we are. He says, but, I repeat, forms are what they are of themselves and in relation to themselves, and things that belong to us are, in the same way, what they are in relation to themselves. You do understand what I mean? Certainly, Socrates says, I understand. So too, he said, knowledge itself, what knowledge is, would be knowledge of that truth itself, which is what truth is. So this is seemingly so basic, but also very complex, because it's a hard thing for me to grasp. So knowledge itself. We think about the form of knowledge. We think about the purity of that thing. We think about its grounding. We think about... Well, let's take it this way. So I made the statement, for my attention, can you provide me a brief chart that gives me the qualities that are associated to the particulars, or what Parmenides says that is associated to us, whatever domain that we consider ourselves to be, and then of the particulars and characteristics that are associated with the intelligible, that of the forms. This is the prompt that I gave ChatGPT. So we have two different domains, the domain that belongs to us, which is the sensible world of particulars, and then we have the belonging to itself, the intelligible world of forms. And so what it gave me was domains: mode of being, structure, unity, location, relationality, causality, stability, knowledge, dependence, participation, quality, expressions, nature of likeness, selfhood, perception, change, and multiplicity. So these are some pretty big ticket items. And then for each of these domains, we have them split into the particulars belonging to us and the forms belonging to themselves. So quickly, I want to go through these. So hopefully this gives us a little bit better of an understanding of the difference between the two orders. So in terms of the mode of being, in terms of the particulars, we have becoming and changing. In terms of the forms, we have pure being and unchanging. This is something we've established. In terms of structure, of the particulars belonging to us, we have composite, mixed, contingent. The forms belonging to themselves, simple, pure, self-identical. Of unity, we have, of the particulars belonging to us, one and many, fragmented. Of the forms belonging to themselves, perfect unity of each form. Location, in terms of belonging to us, of the particulars, we have spatial and temporal. In terms of the forms, or in the intelligible domain, we have non-spatial and non-temporal. In terms of relationality, when it comes to us, we relate to each other within the sensible domain, greater, smaller, likeness, proportion. And within the formal domain, we have relate only to other forms within the intelligible domain, being, same, different. In terms of causality, we have caused, affected, influenced as it relates to us. As it relates to the forms, we have causal in the sense of grounding, not affected. In terms of stability, when it comes to us, we are mutable and perishable. In terms of the forms, they are permanent and eternal. In terms of knowledge, which we are getting into just now, when it comes to us, we have objects of opinion. And when it comes to the intelligible order, we have objects of knowledge, or episteme. Dependence, when it comes to us, we're ontologically dependent on forms. When it comes to the forms, we are the forms are ontologically independent. When it comes to participation, when it comes to us, we partake in forms. The forms do not partake in anything. They are themselves. Now, quality expressions. When it comes to us, there are instances. A beautiful thing, a just act, a large object. When it comes to the forms, we have the pure patterns, beauty itself, justice itself, largeness itself. Nature of likeness. When it comes to us, we resemble the forms imperfectly. We are a step down. When it comes to the intelligible, they do not resemble particulars. Resemblance is one-sided. When it comes to selfhood, when it comes to us, what they are is relational, circumstantial. And the forms, what they are is entirely in themselves. With regard to perception, when it comes to us, it is through the senses, and in the intelligible domain, through the intellect. When it comes to change, we are always changing. The forms are never changing. When it comes to multiplicity, the particulars have infinitely many instances. And in terms of the forms, there is one form for each kind. So then going back to what was said, so too, he said, knowledge itself, what knowledge is, would be knowledge of that truth itself, which is what truth is. So of course, the form of knowledge. Furthermore, each particular knowledge, what it is, would be knowledge of some particular thing, of what that thing is. Isn't that so? Yes. But wouldn't knowledge that belongs to us be of the truth that belongs to our world? And wouldn't it follow that each particular knowledge that belongs to us is in turn knowledge of some particular thing in our world. Necessarily. But, as you agree, we neither have the forms themselves nor can they belong to us. Yes, you're quite right. And truly the kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself. Yes, the very thing we don't have. No, we don't. So none of the forms is known by us, because we don't partake of knowledge itself. It seems not. Then the beautiful itself, what it is, cannot be known by us, nor can the good, nor, indeed, can anything we take to be characters themselves. It looks that way. Here's something even more shocking than that. What's that? Surely you would say that if in fact there is knowledge, a kind itself, it is much more precise than is knowledge that belongs to us, and the same goes for beauty and all the others. So, obviously where we are now is still in that very heavily separated space of the intelligible and of the particulars. And there are these inconsistencies. We neither have the forms themselves nor can they belong to us. Now, they don't belong to us, but what about participation? The kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself, the very thing we don't have. And yet still, by relation of participation, we understand its likeness, I guess we can say, or of its incompleteness, as we know it through opinion or perception. We partake in the forms. It isn't necessary for them to partake in us. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. We're already 2 hours and 20 minutes into this. I'm going to pick this up next time with part 3 of Parmenides.